Before we begin, a quick warning that in this show, we discuss child abuse, and this content may be difficult for some listeners. If you or anyone you know is a victim or survivor of medical child abuse, please go to munchausensupport.com to connect with professionals who can help. On New Year's Eve 2009, 3 years to the day, when my sister dramatically lost the twin pregnancy that never was, my very real nephew arrived significantly ahead of schedule. Premature births are a nearly ubiquitous detail in these cases, and as in other cases I've seen, this birth was followed by a cascade of problems around his eating and his development. For months, my parents and I had this terrible feeling that something was off, but I remember it being so hard to nail down. Megan is very smart, and she was a nurse for some period of time, so she would explain everything about my nephew's health in a way that would be extremely hard to question. And her version of things was usually the only version we had, because she rarely let anyone else go to the doctor with her. And then, for reasons I will never know, she finally did let my mother go to one of my nephew's gastroenterologist appointments with her. And it was during this appointment that a thread came loose that ended up unraveling the whole thing. At this point, my nephew was still in the first year of his life, and he'd been diagnosed as failure to thrive, meaning that he wasn't gaining weight as he should have been. And because of this, he had a nasal gastric feeding tube, i.e. a feeding tube that went in through his nose. Megan had been telling us that her son was going to need a surgically implanted G-tube, but during this appointment, my mom was sitting in the room when the doctor told Megan the opposite, that they should give my nephew more time with the less invasive tube. They wanted to be judicious, for obvious reasons, about rushing an infant into a surgical procedure. The next day, Megan gave me an update on his health. During this time, this was nearly the only thing we talked about, and she told me that, unfortunately, it looked like he was going to need the G-tube surgery. I remember this moment so vividly that I can still picture exactly where I was, driving on the wooded road by the lake that my parents live on. I can still feel the bottom dropping out of my stomach. For once, it was there in black and white. Megan was lying, and the consequences this time were too scary to ignore. And truthfully, this feeling of wrong-footedness is still with me, part of the debris of this disaster. I don't want to give you the wrong idea about the state of my life or my mental health. My life is really good. It's also true that this stuff with my sister, I'm not over it. You don't get over it. When you find yourself caught up in something like this, you're just never the same. People believe their eyes. That's something that is so central to this topic because we do believe the people that we love when they're telling us something. If we didn't, you could never make it through your day. I'm Andrea Dunlop, and this is Nobody Should Believe Me. If you'd like to support the show, the best way to do that is to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or on Patreon. You get all episodes early and ad-free, along with extended cuts and deleted scenes from the season. You also get 2 exclusive bonus episodes every month. And for the first time ever, we have the entire season ready for you to binge right now on the subscriber feed. That's right. You can listen to every episode of Season 5 right this minute if you subscribe to the show. And as always, if monetary support is not an option for you right now, rating and reviewing the show wherever you listen also helps us a great deal. And if there's someone you feel needs to hear this show, please do share it with them. Word of mouth is so important for independent podcasts. For even more, you can also find us on YouTube, where we have every episode as well as bonus video content. When we last left Sophie, she was deep into gymnastics mom mode with her older daughter, Em, driving hours each way for all-day training sessions, all while somehow also caring for her younger daughter, C, whose health was, according to Sophie, increasingly fragile. And somehow, again, she was doing all this with no income. Sophie had also found a new church congregation to lean on, and this one was a bit of a different flavor than her hometown church, Haven.
The way that Hollywood presents the powers of hell is like normal, ordinary people are walking down the street, see something, they shun it, and then wake up the next day demonized. That is not how that works. The enemy has zero authority in the life of a Christian. The enemy can only occupy territory in your heart, your house, your mind, or your family if you come into agreement with a lie that he says.
This new church, Pursuit Northwest, would become a pillar of Sophie's support system here in Seattle. So we wanted to get some additional context about this place from our evangelical history expert, Dr. Lauren Turek.
So the Pursuit Church is not explicitly Pentecostal in terms of denomination. It's not a member of the, Assemblies of God or anything, but they have a lot of the language. So I think they're influenced by it. What's very interesting about Pentecostalism is that, first of all, this is something that emerges. This is a faith tradition that comes in the United States in the early 20th century. It starts as an interracial movement. It does not stay that way. In the 20s, it splits into a black and white Pentecostal church, and there's a sort of lot going on there. But it starts that way. And what's very interesting is in those really early days of Pentecostalism, many of the people who received this sort of Holy Spirit began speaking in tongues. They believed that they were actually speaking foreign languages that meant they should go out to the place that they thought had the language that they were speaking to evangelize. So they were like, I think I'm speaking Chinese. God is calling me to go to China. And so they would go to China, they'd show up, and they would, of course, then realize that they were not speaking Chinese. But that didn't matter. They would stay and they would evangelize there. And this is one of the reasons why Pentecostalism ended up spreading really rapidly through Africa, through Latin America, in Asia. It's one of the largest churches in the world is a Pentecostal church in South Korea that has something like 800,000 congregants in one church, right? And some of the reason it spreads is because there's all this evangelistic work, and some of it's because it's this very ecstatic, emotional experience. You feel a really deep personal connection. There isn't this separation between you and the gospel. So it's really emotional. These are really emotional services. And so I see some of that in the language that this church uses, that they use a language of the Holy Spirit. They're very conservative politically, right? They are opposed to gay marriage. They're certainly anti-abortion. They're very pro-Israel. I mentioned they have this
looks like
really anti-trans. Yeah, they have this sort of statement again of inclusivity, but it's one that really kind of belies that longer history of kind of white evangelical racism and the split in Pentecostalism.
Their lead pastor, Russell Johnson, is young with a shock of bleach blonde hair, and he wears a leather jacket and a ball cap on stage. Recently, he's been seen sporting a red cap that says, "Make prayer great again." So this church really makes no mystery of its political leanings. And from what we could surmise in our conversations with those who knew her, these were political values that Sophie shared. And given her evangelical background and affiliations, it would be surprising if she didn't. Pursuit is a mega church with rock concert vibes, and Pastor Russell's sermons, they are intense.
I have said it before, and I will say it again. We ain't canceling church. We will not close our doors. We will not stop gathering people to worship. We will not cower in fear, and we will not be intimidated by the demonic strongholds in this city.
Beyond the gym that they were spending a lot of time in, this church was the one major place that Sophie and her girls found community.
Yeah, we would see each other in church. And I live north up in Linwood area, and she lives in Renton. So even the practicalities of that, we didn't spend a whole lot of time outside of a church setting other than maybe a birthday party here or there or things like that.
This is from the police interview with Cassandra Johnson, a fellow member of Pursuit Northwest.
What about... I have a son similar age to her, so they were in children's church together, and issues, and that she's often in and out of the hospital, and have tried to be really supportive to Sophie in that regard. At one time, I kept stuck in the hospital, and she needed some backup child care. But other than that, I don't know a whole lot beyond what Sophie already shares.
And it looks like your church did a pretty big fundraiser for Sophie to get a new wheelchair accessible vehicle. Is that correct?
Yes, and I was part of helping to promote that. I didn't do a whole lot of other than like just Facebook promotions and things like that. But I was part of making some of those connections with Sophie and the community that I was involved in any way, but I know that there were other people in the church who were probably more involved on that end through the church for the fundraiser. So specifically, I just know that the church was involved because Sophie was very active there.
This fundraiser for the wheelchair-accessible van was one of the biggest ticket items that Sophie fundraised for. But members of this church remember other smaller things, such as gifts for the girls and just the general sense that their hearts really went out to this family. And not to keep harping on all of Sophie's driving times, but this church is all the way up in Snohomish, which can easily be an hour's drive from where they were living during this time in Renton. Again, just never making things easy on herself. Sophie is taking her younger daughter C to the doctor a lot during this time, and she begins doctor hopping, taking C between Mary Bridge Hospital on the south end and Seattle Children's on the north side of Seattle, and then flying out to Duke in North Carolina to see their renowned specialists after C receives a clinical diagnosis of alternating hemiplegia of childhood. Sophie also claimed that C had severe mobility issues due to her HC, that she would sometimes not be able to walk because of weakness or even be completely paralyzed for hours or days at a time. It's not clear when exactly Sophie started putting C in a wheelchair and leg braces. A hospital noted their use as early as 2016 when C was just 2 years old. Here is how Sophie describes it.
She has a wheelchair and she has a walker. We still utilize those absolutely when she needs it, but it's not a 24/7 thing.
And the leg braces were a bit of a focal point for C, as one mom from their gym remembers.
Because she had like braces on her legs, and
always when you saw her?
I'm trying to think if I remember seeing them without it. Because she would show everybody her braces, and then Sophie would talk about, where they went to get them and what they had to do to get them, and the person who they had made them specially for her. And because I remember she talked about how they had ponies on them, pink, purple ponies, I think.
One of the gymnastics moms also remembers seeing the wheelchair.
Having the youngest daughter with her always, sometimes in a wheelchair walking around, sometimes with leg braces on walking around.
And one of C's school aides, who worked with her as a physical therapist via Zoom during COVID, also recounts.
She had a personal wheelchair, and I actually helped get them equipment.
Okay.
So she has a personal wheelchair, and it was set up as a very dependent style, meaning it wasn't configured in a way that a student who had ability could self-propel it.
Right.
So we had some adjustment made so that could be, she could self-propel. She had an adapted bike, which she had outgrown, and so she obtained a new bike.
And that was through the school?
The school doesn't purchase anything. It's all through private insurance.
Okay, got it.
I sometimes have to support those purchases, and I do. Many of my students are medically fragile, so they have significant equipment needs, so I am the one who often has to write a letter stating medical necessity of things. In the case of her equipment, the bike was, I think, through her private funds, and she also received a gait trainer through a nonprofit.
And did you ever see, so was primarily in her wheelchair when you were communicating with her?
No.
Now, it's worth noting that not everyone who uses a wheelchair or mobility aid needs it all the time. Nonetheless, these discrepancies are notable. And Sophie, in her own words, says that even the doctors doubted her.
Or you have people looking at me like I'm crazy, like she's fine. Like I've had a provider be like, she doesn't need a wheelchair, she doesn't need braces, like she needs to be a kid. And I'm like, do you think she could have gotten all of those things if there weren't several individuals who are professionals in their field of orthotics and equipment that could need to see those things in order for it to be warranted to be paid for insurance? Just like you have to get pre-authorization for an MRI, like you can't just go and get a $13,000 wheelchair without the specialist, all of the
documentation.
You just can't. That's silly. It's not like I'm buying a wheelchair off the street and being like, hey, my kid needs a wheelchair. It's like, no, you have to have so many things in line.
And sure, you would need a doctor's approval to get aides through insurance. But as C's PT noted, many of these items were purchased via private funds.
In the case of her equipment, I think through her private funds. And she also received a gait trainer through a nonprofit.
As for the wheelchair, this appears to have been paid for by a local commercial painting contractor. In a video posted on the company's YouTube page, they say that they had the, quote, privilege of playing a part in C's life. We were able to donate the finances to acquire this amazing wheelchair, which happens to be in her favorite color. Here's Sophie in that same video.
We're so thankful to Scott Coatings for their corporate sponsorship. Couldn't do it without corporate sponsors.
But many of the folks who were seeing C regularly, like her neighbor, had questions about how much she actually needed this chair.
You know, she has a wheelchair. She was they were in this church that spent, $80,000 to get this wheelchair lift in the car they've never used. And the only time I've seen that kid in a wheelchair is when this film crew came and did this documentary about her, and they were all dressed up and she's in a wheelchair. But then when they left, she's running literally circles in the thing, stuff like that, man.
And just a note here, we haven't been able to confirm this $80,000 number. The figures we found were closer to $30,000. So this all begs the question, what do we know about C's various diagnoses at this time? And what, if anything, would have required her to use a wheelchair? Now, there were some objective findings early on with C. When she was about 2 years old, she had an abnormal MRI that indicated possible static encephalopathy, which could be an indicator for cerebral palsy. Emphasis on could. There was never a definitive diagnosis of CP, and cerebral palsy, like many things, is a clinical diagnosis. There is no definitive test. The vast majority of the various diagnoses C received were based on Sophie's reports, which, as friend of the show, Dr. Bex, a pediatric hospitalist and MBP expert, explains is almost always the case.
A clinical diagnosis is a diagnosis that relies on the story and the symptoms that are being described more than anything I can do a specific test for or a physician can do a specific test for. So often there is no lab diagnosis, MRI diagnosis. It is ruling out other things sometimes and then being left with the story and the symptoms fitting the condition. The problem is, in medicine, there are a lot of diagnoses that we don't have that one perfect test for. And I think I was just talking to my friend this week about how in pediatrics, I think it's even a little bit different because we're not relying on what the patient is telling us in some cases. We're relying on what the parent is telling us. And pediatricians in general are trustworthy people who is taught and is trained to listen to the parent or listen to the story and try to come up with a diagnosis.
As for C's wheelchair, leg braces, and gait trainers, we have more definitive information about whether those were necessary. A letter from Seattle Children's to the Department of Children and Families says this about a June 20th, 2019 visit to Children's where C arrived in a wheelchair. Hartman was told that CH needed absolutely no braces, orthotics, wheelchairs, etc. According to the records, after the examination, Hartman was told that CH actually needed normal activity and play in order to develop appropriate muscle strength and physical development. Use of mobility-limiting devices, like orthotics and wheelchairs, can delay development in children, making them dependent on care providers. Nonetheless, on June 24th, 2019, Hartman brought CH in with leg braces on and in a wheelchair. There are many instances of C being seen in a wheelchair after this date, including during a professional photo shoot she did with her equine therapy team. Wheelchairs of dubious necessity are a hallmark of these cases. Maya Kowalski, Justina Pelletier, and perhaps most famously, Gypsy Rose Blanchard, all had wheelchairs that they did not need. It's a dramatic prop. A child in a wheelchair is something that immediately elicits concern and sympathy. In nearly all of the fundraising videos and images, C is in a wheelchair. But then, when they were off camera, it was a completely different story, as their next-door reports here.
We've never actually seen her using the wheelchair. We saw her once being pushed around with a photographer in the cul-de-sac taking pictures of her in it, but we've never seen her use it. Never, ever, any other time, she got the wheelchair car, the whole GoFundMe thing, and asking for money to pay for it, and getting the church to pay for it. And we were like, well, we've never seen her in it. I don't. Maybe they use it when they're out. If they go out, I don't know. We've never seen her in it though.
Okay. Did Sophie say anything about need for a wheelchair at all to you?
Something about if like she's not in a, and maybe she can't walk from an episode, but she's not totally paralyzed. They use it or something.
Okay.
But no, I don't remember anything specific about her why she needed it.
The charade of an unnecessary wheelchair isn't just about having useful props for attention-seeking and fundraising. It's also a piece of the deep and relentless psychological abuse endemic to these cases. These props function as a reminder to the child that they are sick, that they are different, that the activities of their peers are out of reach for them. They are reminders of who is in control of the story. And in Sophie's case, these props were just one small piece of the dire story she was weaving for her youngest daughter. In a continuation of her early blogging efforts, Sophie was very active on social media during this time. And as with many parents, she took to Instagram in the mid-2010s, where she kept prolific accounts on her own social media profile, as well as one dedicated to C. I know that many parents do this sort of thing in a much more benign way, but I would like to go on the record and say, please don't. Don't make family accounts chronicling your child's every move. Don't start writing in their voice, and please, don't put pictures of your children in vulnerable medical situations on the internet. Just don't. During this time, Sophie was posting constantly about C's issues, much of it in the name of, quote, raising awareness about C's rare neurological condition. But she also included numerous photos of C's feeding tube and talked about it quite a bit. According to Sophie, this intervention was recommended by Marybridge Hospital, which is located in Tacoma, just south of where Sophie was living at the time.
We need to start with genetic testing, and we need to start with a gastric scan to see how fast contents are moving in her stomach.
Oh, okay.
So they did those two things. The gastric scan came back that like a normal stomach is supposed to empty within like 90 minutes, and after 4 hours. So it showed a delayed gastric empty, which would explain that like food, even after 30 minutes of sitting in your high chair, is not moving out of her stomach. So she's throwing up. So it made perfect sense. We were like, okay, great. So then the gastric provider was like, this is pretty darn bad. We need to talk about kind of intervention.
What did they say about how bad it was? Because that sounds awful to me.
He just said, I think his word was, this is, like, he called me on the phone to tell me, and he just said, this is a pretty marked finding.
Okay.
So, quick question.
Yeah.
So when you were, and she's not emptying her bowels, right?
Right.
There's a delay in that.
Yeah.
When that's happening, is she in pain? Or what is her physical reaction when her bowels are not emptying on that timeline rough type thing?
So her bowels is another story, but her stomach, yes, she definitely has had times where, so further testing indicated that she needed a cecostomy tube. So her delay is all the way down her gut and not just her stomach.
Right, because the gastric emptying is like more like
getting everything out of your stomach into your intestine.
Into your intestines, right.
So then we figured that out, and great, let's help get movement. We got a G tube. But then if your lower bowel is not moving, then that's going to cause problems because you're getting stuff to go down. So she ended up getting a cecostomy tube as well, and that flushes out her bowel.
These interventions that Sophie is describing are not inconsequential. Both involve surgeries and carry a risk of infection. The G-tube procedure in particular is ubiquitous in medical child abuse cases, and it's especially terrifying in this context because it gives a perpetrator direct access to introduce medications and other substances, as we saw in the Brittany Phillips case in season 2, where she poisoned her daughter. And once again, Sophie's consistent reports to doctors and others about C's ability to eat or keep down food did not match up with what others observed. Here's Sophie's mother, Anne.
What have I seen her eat?
Yeah.
Sandwiches, apples.
Okay. Just regular
veggies, regular food. Yep.
Okay. Yep.
Have
you ever seen her not able to eat or throwing up?
Okay. I've never seen her throwing up, but I have seen her not being able to eat. And
Okay.
so then she's, Sophie will put her feeding tube connected. I've seen her walk around with that on her little backpack.
Okay, that's got to be hard to see.
So swallowing can be hard for her, too.
Sophie's reports to the doctors about C's food issues are prolific, and she pushes hard for escalating interventions during this time, from the G-tube to the more invasive GJ tube that C had for a time. But again, others observed a different relationship between C and food. Here is Sophie's father, Art, reflecting on his time with his granddaughter.
Have you ever seen her, like throwing up or unable to eat or any of those types of behaviors?
I've not seen her throwing up. One thing that I will say is that her whole stomach and digestive system doesn't really work very well, so she actually has to be treated with a cestostomy every single night. No, well, the only thing I'd say about food is, in fact, the opposite is true. Would eat as much as we'd feed her, but given the fact that her digestive system is so messed up, my daughter has to regulate that because she would cause herself serious health issues.
Okay, just
so
like
my
kid in a candy store, eat too much.
Yeah, she would eat as much as you give her. My daughter, we actually have to regulate how much she eats because of her digestive stomach issues.
Gotcha.
And then she cannot rid her food, and that's why she has to have a G tube and an S tube, and then has to sit on the toilet for an hour every single night. So it's a complicated situation.
During this period, C was spending a lot of time at hippotherapy. That is physical therapy with horses, not hippos, and she appeared to be thriving so much there that there was talk of her pursuing dressage. This is the ancient sport of fancy horse dancing. And if you are thinking, wow, that sounds like an extremely expensive hobby, you are correct. Anyway, here is one of C's hippotherapy providers.
Talks about food all the time. Yeah. It's one of her favorite subjects. She's like, oh, we're going to go and get donuts after this, or we're going to go to, so they used to have therapy and then have a gap and then have adaptive, and they used to go and get a snack in between, because I'd always ask them, where did you go for your snack today? And they quite often would go to Starbucks. I went to Starbucks and I had whatever.
And this is another member of Sophie's church on a call with a detective. And just a note that she is with her child in this phone call, so you will hear a baby in the background. Relatable.
She fixates on food, so Sophie has to keep her diet very in check because she can choke. And she's had the J-tube, the stomach stuff, because part of the disorder is digestive stuff. And so before they figured that out, she would puke instantly after eating. Every time she would bend down, everything would just come out. But she loves food.
And so when you were around her after she had the tube placed, was that how she primarily got her food in your experience?
No, she would still eat by mouth unless she was in episode.
These reports are haunting because they echo what we've heard from the family of Alyssa Wayburn in season 2. And this detail about a child being able to eat normally and somehow still supposedly needing a G-tube, again, it's ubiquitous in the research about medical child abuse, and unfortunately deeply familiar from the 2 investigations into my sister Megan. As I said at the top of this episode, it was Megan's push for this very intervention that brought the whole thing crashing down for my family. As far as we know, she never did end up getting a G-tube placed for my nephew, but it wasn't long after everything blew up with my family that Megan got pregnant again. That baby didn't make it. And not 7 months later, she had my niece, who would go on to get a G-tube. To help us get some more context around G-tubes and normal eating behaviors, we spoke to Dr. Jill Glick, an experienced child abuse pediatrician from the University of Chicago. is there any medical scenario where like you could have a child that is like going to the neighbor's house and eating pizza, but they still need a G-tube? And like that's that all these people are observing this child eating normally?
The question is if they're eating and they're doing okay is the difference, because there are kids who are not supposed to be taking oral or whatever, and they'll get in trouble, right? But if you're having a kid who's eating pizza, I'm just hypothetically, you have a kid who's eating pizza and doing fine, or eating all this stuff and doing fine, you have to beg the question of why you have a G-tube.
Right. So, I mean, that is the scenario that we're looking at, where it's like people are observing the kid, not cheating on their doing it. So the parent is saying, oh, they shouldn't be doing that. But then like, or sometimes they're saying it's fine. And then most
parents would say, hey, that's great.
Right.
Let's get this kid off this G-tube.
Rather than escalating for an even more severe intervention.
Most parents don't want a G-tube. And in fact, I've been involved with lots of ex-preemies where they needed a G-tube for growth and development, and the parents so wanted them to eat from a bottle, and they were begging, can we do anything but the G-tube? I want my kid to be normal and well. So that's my experience. And so no, it doesn't make any sense. And I mean, there's going to be conditions where you're, like I said, they're going to be doing some oral, some G-tube, but it's transitional usually, unless, like I said, someone had a horrible esophageal cancer and they had to do some reconstruction. And it's like, you can take some from up, or you had cancer in your neck. You can take some from up, but you'll choke a little bit, but we have to make sure you get enough by G-tube. But that's not the case. No. Okay, if you're eating pizza and pepperoni and all that stuff, it's probably not.
This is where people looking at these cases, unfortunately, and perhaps especially the judges tasked with making the calls, get stopped up. If a child didn't need this surgery, why on earth would the doctors do it? And the answer turns out to be pretty straightforward, because the parent wasn't telling the truth. Sophie consistently pushes for these interventions by reporting constant, severe vomiting up blood, inability to drink water without aspirating, and C choking on her food. And on several occasions, she brings C to the ER, claiming that she's dehydrated because of this alleged chronic vomiting, only to have C's clinical exam show that, in fact, she's just fine. This is also when Sophie begins her pattern of doctor shopping, as well as false and exaggerated reports. For example, in 2016, when C was just over 2 years old, she underwent 3 separate swallow studies to determine how well she was able to tolerate eating by mouth. The first test came back normal, though Sophie swiftly reported to the next doctor that the study came back abnormal. The second of the 3 tests came back with mild findings, but a G-tube was never recommended. They simply suggested adding some thickener to C's liquids as a precaution. Sophie, however, reported that this study showed severe issues with swallowing. A third swallow study, 2 months later, came back once again normal, no issues. But Sophie argues with this, saying that C is simply able to, quote, perform the ability to swallow when she's in a hospital setting. And if you don't think that sounds medically plausible, you're correct, it's not. And a lot of this false reporting is happening from one provider to the next. So you may be asking, why didn't these hospitals just get all the records from each other? Well, they can't do that without a parent's permission. And it's via this pattern of lies and exaggerations that Sophie eventually succeeds in getting a G-tube placed on July 10th, 2017, less than 2 weeks after receiving a provisional diagnosis of alternating hemiplegia of childhood from Marybridge Hospital. Sophie quickly connects with the Cure Age C Foundation, and this group posts a photo of C on their Facebook page the day of her G-tube surgery, asking for well wishes. C looks up from a hospital bed, a pacifier in her mouth, clutching a teddy bear with stitching that reads Cure AHC. This foundation would go on to provide funding for the family to travel to Duke Medical Center in North Carolina to visit their renowned clinic dedicated to the disorder. This pattern of reporting from Sophie can be seen clearly in a note from the doctor who ordered the G-tube placement at Marybridge Hospital. Quote, Mom feels strongly that she needs an access point to get her fluids for AHC. Mom also is not sure if she will tolerate boluses or fluids in these episodes of vomiting and presumed dehydration. Mom feels that having an access point will help during AHC episodes and would like her to be on continuous feeds overnight to maintain her hydration and support her fluid goals and nutritional outcomes. This information was provided by Hartman, though during objective observation, CH was never seen to have any issues with eating, drinking, vomiting, or dehydration. So you'll notice within these notes, there's a lot of mom reports, mom feels, mom says this. Dr. Glick reminds us why the parental history is so important in these cases.
In medicine, we rely on the honesty and integrity of the parents trying to help their child. And unfortunately, in child abuse and medical child abuse, the motivations, I'm not a psychiatrist, but it's not what we don't have a shared mission of getting this child better. So therefore, we have to be kind of more sleuth and look for what I call the big disconnects in what we see and what we hear, with these patients.
Now, you might be wondering why all this communication hasn't been made simpler in the age of electronic medical records. But it turns out those haven't been quite the godsend that some hoped for.
Jill Glick at 65, my medical record at the University of Chicago has a lot of mistakes in it. I don't have diabetes. I don't have COPD. I can't get my record fixed because my primary is not at the University of Chicago. Oh. He can't go in and get rid of it because somehow that got listed by a mistake and there's no quality improvement. When I was a resident, the residents always look at me and roll their eyes. I said, when I was a resident, you got the medical record and you opened up and the first page was the problems list and you took your pen and you crossed out the ones that no longer existed and you made a new progress. You said, these are the current medical and these are your chronic diseases. That communication's been lost. So Munchausen by proxy cases, MCA cases, we help that process by not having universal medical record. Everybody should have a baseline universal medical record, and the people who make a lot of money off of Epic. I mean, Judy, whatever her name is, God bless her, she's a smart lady in 1970s to come up with electronic record. And I was like, this is so cool. Being a geek, the next thing I know is I hate it.
Yeah.
So that adds to it. So part of one of the things I would always love is that there be a national requirement of all electronic records have to talk to each other.
Yeah.
And not just talk to each other. Show everything. Like right now, if I go into another hospital, I only get like little snippets.
Judy, whatever her name is Judy Faulkner, founder of Epic, which revolutionized electronic medical records and is currently used for the records of 325 million people. This product made her a billionaire. But a side note, before anyone makes a wanted poster with her face on it, she has pledged to give away 99% of her $7.7 billion fortune to charity. Good on you, Judy. But as Dr. Glick says here, because there are multiple proprietary systems for electronic records that don't integrate with each other, this is far from a fix. And it's these very cracks in the system that perpetrators exploit, where they see just enough doubt and confusion to keep pushing their story through. And Sophie does push this story of C through to the G-tube surgery, but she doesn't stop there. It's not long before she's requesting TPN, or total parenteral nutrition, where a child receives intravenous nutrition via a port. And throughout these early years of C's life, the evidence mounts that Sophie is taking her daughter down a very dark road. Next time.
The G-tube cases are the ones that track hardest towards death. They're the ones that in the medical literature, that when they talk about just how deadly this type of abuse is, the fact that it is arguably the most deadly of all types of abuse regarding children.
Nobody Should Believe Me is written, hosted, and executive produced by me, Andrea Dunlop. Our senior producer is Mariah Gossett, story editing by Nicole Hill, research and fact-checking by Aaron Ajayi, and our associate producer is Greta Stromquist. Mixing and engineering by Robin Edgar, administrative support from Nola Carmouche. If you or anyone you know is a victim or survivor of medical child abuse, please go to munchausensupport.com to connect with professionals who can help.